Welcome to Complete Wavelab 9 by Streamworks Audio. My name's Walt Honeycutt, and I'll be your host and instructor as we get into this incredible piece of software. Well, hold on. Let me stop right there and back up and say, as we get into these 7 pieces of incredible software, because Wavelab is a different animal. It's not really one program, it's a bunch of programs. And in fact, if you look at the splash screen that comes up when you first launch it, it says the Audio Mastering Suite. And that's really the mindset that you have to have as you come to this program. Now, with that in mind, it adds a challenging dimension to trying to teach it because there are few programs out there that have such a wide range of users. And here's what I mean. If you look at Cubase, Cubase is very clearly focused on either songwriters and musicians or producers. And Nuendo has an even more laser-like focus on audio post-production for film and video. But Wavelab covers the waterfront. Wavelab is used by everybody from mastering houses to the FBI to the National Transportation Safety Board because it can do everything from forensic analysis to spectrum editing to montage and mastering. So there is an incredibly wide range of users and an incredibly wide range of applications here. And that makes it somewhat challenging to teach because we're speaking to so many different audiences at once. So with that in mind, let me offer this bit of advice. Now, these videos are highly technical in nature, and we're going to start with the theory and the fundamentals. And although tutorial videos are typically a show and tell sort of operation, the first few chapters are going to be primarily telling, and that's just a function of the academics. But I would say you're more than welcome to jump to the later chapters where we're doing the specific demonstrations like taking the siren out of the background of an interview or removing the cough from the middle of a violin solo or restoring an old recording. You can certainly go and watch the demonstration chapters, learn how to do those things, and then come back to the fundamentals and the academics and the theory as needs be later on. So with that in mind, let's run through a quick overview piece, and then we'll come right back here and start getting into the details.
In this section, we're going to take a general overview of Wavelab in order to set the stage for the rest of this course. Now, admittedly, these first few chapters are really aimed at someone who's coming to Wavelab for the first time. But even if you're an experienced user, we're going to go over some fundamentals as well as some things that have changed in version 9, so I recommend that you hang out and enjoy these first few chapters because they're going to help you transition faster. Let me say congratulations on Wavelab 9, but you have tied into a monster because Wavelab is just a different creature. It is marketed as one program, but it's really more like 7 different programs flying in tight formation. So for starters, there's an audio editor, and that's fairly close to a DAW like Cubase. You also have montage capability, which allows you to stitch together multiple songs, and that's primarily to assemble an album. Then logically after that, you have all the CD prep and burning tools, which include metadata and so forth. And all that's still pretty approachable, even for the casual user. But then right next to that, you have scripting tools. And this isn't script as in screenplay. This is script as in JavaScript. Wavelab has its own computer programming language, and you can use it to automate highly specific and repetitive tasks. But to do this, you have to learn Wavelab's scripting language. Now, that's certainly out of the reach of the casual user, and it's certainly something you're not going to learn through just trial and error. Then, you have an entire set of dedicated podcasting tools, which include all of the RSS and metadata functions, plus the basic recording and production. And here again, this is fairly technical and entirely specific to podcasting. Wavelab also includes a tool set for DVD audio, and finally some very powerful batch processing tools. On top of this, it also includes a ton of restoration and sonic enhancement tools, which is much closer to something like Ozone or some of the mastering-specific Waves plugins. And the point here is twofold. First, it's unlikely that any one user will need all of this functionality. In fact, I'll bet that you probably bought Wavelab primarily for 1 or maybe 2 of these capabilities. But they don't really point that out anywhere. So what I see a lot of the time is a new user who feels that they must be missing something because so much of this seems completely foreign. For example, somebody doing professional podcasting would likely never look at the CD mastering capabilities. And conversely, somebody producing CDs for a corporate training department or someone conducting forensic analysis might never open the podcasting dialog. And that brings me to my second point, which is that in all of this, when it comes to Wavelab, Steinberg assumes you're an expert user. Until recently, they didn't even offer a light version of Wavelab. The simple fact is that most of the people using Wavelab are earning their living with Wavelab. So overall, Wavelab is much more down to business than some other applications which are aimed at a less professional user base. So as a result, when you're first learning Wavelab, you spend a lot of time saying things like, where in the world is this? Or what in the world is that? And how do I do this? All of that can make Wavelab feel slippery and frustrating, but it's really just a question of learning the differences, and that is what this course is all about. So with that in mind, let's get started.
Okay, this is a completely empty Wavelab project, and a couple of things that I want to talk about in the general layout before we get into the configuration details is that in version 9 you have the central area with the blue header bar at the top, which is called the ribbon, and that has become core to the entire thing. The ribbon is going to be your basically your control center for the entire program. And on that ribbon, the first tab here, the File tab, is going to be the heart of that whole system. And you'll find an awful lot of things on the File tab that you might traditionally reach for in a drop-down menu up at the top, and some of them are still here, but an awful lot of that functionality has moved exclusively to the File tab. So when in doubt, start here. When you open that up, you're going to see that it's divided into a couple of columns and then a properties area. And the first column with the colored tabs, green, yellow, red, and blue, is going to sort of nest different groups of functionality. And the first one, the Info tab, is grayed out at the moment because there's nothing in this project yet. So there's no waveform or montage about which Wavelab can give us any information. Then the yellow tab is where you'll find all of your opening, import, and creation tools. The red tab is going the other way, your save and export. And then down at the bottom, the preferences and tools, this is where most of your setup is going to take place when you're initially configuring the program. So let's look specifically at preferences, and you can see that there's a second column for a variety of, again, different families of setup. And in the global area at the highest level, you've got your general stuff all the way out to, what language do you want the program to run in, where different users are going to maintain their settings folders and stuff like that. The basics about how the displays and audio are going to work and so on. And I would say for probably 90% of the users, the defaults here will be okay, at least to get started. Let's spend a little more time, however, on the second tab, the VST audio connections. And this is going to be one of your first stops after you install Wavelab, because this is where you're going to connect it to your sound card, audio interface, that sort of thing. And you'll see you've got 4 sub-tabs associated with the VST connections for playback recording, ASIO plugins, which are different from VST plugins, and then options. And this playback tab is probably where you'll spend most of your time, because unlike Cubase or Nuendo and others, recording is almost an afterthought in Wavelab. With the exception of the podcasting tool set, almost everything in here assumes that you're going to be working with pre-recorded audio that was captured or created elsewhere and then pulled into Wavelab. So the first stop here is to introduce it to your audio device. And at the moment on this system, we've got, of course, the built-in audio. And obviously, we're dealing with a Mac. If you're in a Windows environment, which is where Wavelab grew up, some of the nomenclature is going to be a little bit different, especially with regards to drivers and things, but the functions are identical here. So you want to pick out your interface there, and you can access its control panel right down to clock source and all that other stuff through those series of nested windows. And actually, before we leave this, the buffer size, something to think about in Wavelab, since you're not working with a performer in real time. You have the luxury to afford yourself much larger buffers, and you can tolerate the higher latency values that come with that, and it'll give you even more pad to work with in terms of preventing dropouts and maintaining quality and so forth and so on. So you can certainly afford buffer sizes that are much larger than you might otherwise typically use in a DAW environment. Then, really the key to this next series of screens is related to your different speaker configurations. So if you look in the lower right-hand corner below the master section, you have the option of up to 8 different speaker configurations. And how elaborate this setup process is going to depend on how capable your interface is and how you'd like it set up. So you can see there's a flexible name field here. You can call this whatever you want. and then you're going to map that to each of your speaker configurations. Then below, you have what would amount to the port naming in a lot of other applications. So we have, in this particular setup, we've got mains, we've got NS10s, we've got a Yamaha subwoofer for the 5.1 setup, then one of these little the Orotone monocube things, and then 2 unused channels. And in this first setup, which is what we run in most of the time, which is just the control room mains, you can see that the left and right control room channels here are mapped to the analog outputs 1 and 2 on the MR816, and then that's it. And this whole thing is then designated as speaker configuration number 1. Now, if I select configuration number 2, none of the naming conventions to the left are going to change. Those ports are fixed, but you'll notice that the analog outputs change from 1 and 2 to 3 and 4. So we can switch between the small mains and the large mains there. And if we go to configuration 3, the surround setup, you'll see that all of these 6 outputs are used in that configuration and so forth. And then configuration 4 is called the mono check, and the only one active is the output 7, which feeds the little single speaker at the bottom. And so this is probably where, again, depending on your setup, this is where you'll spend most of your time mapping inputs and outputs and so forth. And I guess this also assumes that somewhere you've got a list of how all of your physical ports on your interface are connected to the real world. And we come to the recording tab, and it's essentially the same basic mapping layout. You've got the names of your ports over here to the left, and then the associated, or the names of your channels, the associated device input, and then if you're doing some specific monitoring beyond your speaker configuration, you can set that here. So here you can see we've got the 2 booths with the boom mics in them, the outputs from a turntable, and then our tape machines, and which are actually disconnected at the moment, which is not good. And you're going to take the whatever input you're going to use, you're going to map it to the hardware device in question, and then you're going to set up any monitoring that you need there. The next tab over, ASIO plugins, that is a fundamentally different plugin than VST plugins. VST plugins you're going to deal with down here on this lower tab. We'll get to that in a moment. But ASIO plugins are really closer to external devices or an external effect. If you've got a piece of hardware in the rack, like a harmonizer or a Lexicon PCM reverb or so forth, this is where you would route the ins and outs to that associated piece of hardware. And then over in the options tab, you've got your release and your buffer options. And as we talked about before, you can afford a much higher value for a sound buffer, ASIO buffer here, because you're not worried about the real-time playback, typically for a musician in a booth or something like that. And then the option here to release the driver in the background, you can select either anytime Wavelab is in the background or only give it over to a Cubase. And in a nutshell, if you're not familiar, if you don't turn on this option, anytime Wavelab is running, it's going to grab a hold of the sound card and hang on to it, so no other application on your system can use it. So you can't bounce out to iTunes and listen to something or play a YouTube video and have sound. You have to tell it to release the audio driver to those other applications when they're in use, and you do that right here. So that's the fundamentals of getting your input, getting your input and output connections configured, any external hardware, and then your basic administrative options for the sound card, all on this tab here. Now, before we move on and get back out of the File tab in the next unit and start looking at the bigger chunks of the program, let's just run through a couple of these other tabs real quick. The Shortcuts tab here is essentially where you would set up any shortcut keys. So if you want, pick something here. If you want to call up your, if you want to create a shortcut key to add a mono track, you would select that, and then you can edit it, click Edit, you type the appropriate keystroke that you want there, and then if you want a second and third and so forth, you can configure all of those and then hit OK. And I'm going to cancel out of that. But normally, here again, most other applications you may have worked with are probably going to call this key command instead of shortcut, and it would more likely hang out in one of the menus up ahead. or up overhead. Then you have all of your plugin control, and this is VST plugin. So plugin more in the traditional sense that we're used to working with in a piece of software. And at the moment, we have everything that's not a specific plugin that came with Wavelab subdued. You see this folder's this area is the ignore area, so don't load any of these plugins. And that's partially so that the tutorial isn't confusing, and partially because you just don't need Halion, Sonic SE, or the Grand, or any of these other musically oriented things to be active and chewing up CPU cycles in the background in something like this. But you've got some of your defaults about how you want the different controls to work. And then here you can come in and organize your favorites. You can prioritize which families of plugins you want to use and so forth. And you will see a version of this menu over and over again. When you go to, say, the mastering section, you're going to add a plugin from the Sonix family, Steinberg, Vox and Go here. What's available in these menus as you're moving around is going to largely depend on what you have configured here. So when you get ready to start fine-tuning your plugin world, that's going to be on this tab down again in the File tab. Okay, just two more quick stops in the setup discussion here, and then we'll move back out to more of the program. Let's look now at the Remote Control Devices tab. And the first stop here is to note that you can have up to 10 of these things. We have 2 configured, so if I select MIDI control device number 1, you're going to see that's this generic USB interface. If I go to device number 2, that's our CC121 device. Let's just hop back to device 1, and we're going to tell it which device to use for MIDI device 1. And then if you activate the Edit Map button, it's going to give you access to all of the different categories of control. And if we look at something basic like global and then transport, you can come in here and select the item you want. And then down below in the yellow is where you would, you can name your action there. And then when you click into the yellow field, you've activated a MIDI learn function, and then you can select whichever key or button or rotary control that you want. And then when you hit save, this comes back to life. That's a little bit confusing in that you select a function. As soon as you click into the MIDI learn, everything goes gray up above, and it looks like the process is finished, and it's not. You have to save it in order to, I guess you have to name it and save it in order to complete the process. So that's one thing that's a little bit baffling when you're first getting set up. But this will let you get into each of those different areas and configure however you want your hardware device to interact with it. Then let's take a brief look at folders here, and we're going to come back to this subject in detail when we talk about file handling. But remember, basically what we're configuring here are preferences for folders, and look at all the folder types available to you. You have 3 different temporary folders, sometimes called work folders, and that's where Wavelab is doing its real-time saving and editing while you've got something up and working on it. And they give you options for 3 temporary folders in case you've got a RAID configuration or multiple platters, multiple hard disks that you're working with on your workstation. You can specify up to 3 different temporary folders to try and keep the CPU load down and the overall speed of your workflow up. And then you've got the option here to define, and all of these, after you select one, you're going to come over here and define where you want it to go. The companion files is just what its name implies. Whenever you're working with these different chunks of audio, there's information beyond what's saved in the header. For example, how the waveform appears on the screen, or what zoom level you had set when you were working on it. All that information needs to be stored too, but that's not part of the audio file itself. It just, again, it comes alongside. And so this companion files folder is, you have normally it would save the audio and the companion information about display and stuff in the same place, but you have the option of making all the companion files go elsewhere if you want. And then again, you see for each of these things, for audio file, montage, and so forth, you've got an open folder and a save folder. And you could probably just let Wavelab stand up its own default configurations when you're first getting started. But depending on how elaborate your workstation is, or what your network needs are and so forth. You can get into the folders preference dialog and configure all of that stuff. And then the variables tab is just read only. This isn't really a preference as much as a reference. But as you get into the metadata and your CDs and elsewhere, you've got lots of text fields and other data fields, and this is going to summarize all of those and give you the codes, as well as you can add custom stuff here if you want to. We'll deal with that later. And then the last two are really just display preferences for audio files and montages, and each one of them you're going to have editing, file, and style. And there's your style tab again there. So just as a quick example, in audio files, you can pick a couple of canned themes here for how you want the overall program to look. Or if you activate custom, then all of these options come to life, and you can pick something like, say, your waveform display. And if you just really don't want that color blue, you can come over here and you can move stuff around, and you can tweak this thing and make it look however you want it to look. Okay, finally, I want to take just a brief look at the help resources available in Wavelab. And a lot of them are pretty common, like there's a tooltip function. If you hover over a control, it's going to pop up a window that tells you about what that control does. It'll also show you a shortcut key if there's one associated with it. But if you press Shift and F1, you'll get this What's This tool? And that essentially turns any place that you hover into a tooltip. And so, for example, if you hover over the top view down here, it's going to say this is a secondary place to visualize audio. Down here says it's the main place, and so on. If I come up over a workspace, it's going to tell me that, and then an option to click on this link and open more documentation about workspace. And this right here is essentially the same content as the operations manual, but it's presented a little bit differently. If we come over to help and then go down to the PDF documentation, that's going to launch preview and give you, take this all the way back to the top here. This is going to give you the main PDF user manual, all 800 pages of it. And again, I think most of the content in here is going to be the same as what you'll get with the with this presentation. It's just a different way to get into it. You can also activate that What's This tool right there out of the drop down, but I think Shift F1 is going to be a little bit faster. And if you and let me bring that up again. No. So if we come up here and launch that tool, we get this presentation. You can also get into this directly out of the help menu by coming down to contents right there. It's going to open that same help tool, which is again core content, but a little different presentation than the owner's manual or the operations manual. So throughout all of this, keep in mind that you've got those resources available, and especially if you're moving into an area of Wavelab that you haven't used in a while or you don't use on a daily basis, those can be pretty good memory jogs to get you up and going again. So with that, let's dive into looking at the different areas of Wavelab on a little higher level here in the next chapter.